All right. Hi, everybody. Time for our first real stream of the year. Wait. Oh. I'm sorry. I just noticed that in the border I added that it says Game Master's Day Off. That's the wrong image. Let me replace that real quick. In the meantime, everybody say hello. I'm sorry.
How y'all doing?
Hey everyone, good to be back. Thanks for having me.
All right.
It's nice to have you in it too.
All right. Here we go. Nope. Sorry. You try to check everything and then there we go. And again, perfect start for the year. Super professional as always, messing everything up right at the beginning.
Beep, beep.
Okay. Oh boy. Now let's move a bit up. There we go. That is better. Again, so first real stream of the year. The topic is how your setting changes your tabletop RPG design, how it influences the rules, what you have to consider. Because let's be honest, high fantasy is not the same as cosmic horror. As much as some dragon game players want to force that into the dragon game.
So the personal, I swear.
Mm.
Gosh, there are gonna be memes about this later, aren't there?
Hey, the more memes, the better, right? That means we left a cultural impact. But yeah, Ian, you wanted to start off with something, right?
I do. So while we're getting on the topic um of how settings influence games, I want to talk briefly about how settings should influence games for everyone out there who's developing their own game or developing, a module or supplementary material for an existing game. And that is that looking at your setting is actually really important for determining your mechanics and influencing them. Um, and it can even and actually should influence things like numbers, which is something a lot of newer designers don't realize. So to give an example of that, let's look at Dungeons and Dragons, which is obviously a very well known game. Um, in Dungeons and Dragons, you have these six ability scores, which represent your character's core stats. And D&D is like a high fantasy game, so you're expected to be an epic hero, to go out and save the world. Like you're so much, I guess, cooler and better and more destined for greatness than the average person. Now, if we look at these ability scores, it's made pretty clear throughout D&D books that the average human has scores of 10 across the board. Now, if you look at the a typical range of scores for a player character in D&D, you'll see they're much higher. And what this does is it facilitates that feeling of being an epic hero, being destined for greatness, um, having that sort of like fate or destiny kind of on your side, because you're meant to achieve more than the average person. Whereas a more like gritty survival focused game might have you having scores averaging right around whatever the average person is, because you literally are an average person. You're not special. You're not necessarily destined for greatness, and it creates a very different feel and experience. That's just one example, but I wanted to bring it up because it's important to think about these things. Um, in conclusion to that, your mechanics should always support your setting and your intended feel, because when those things are out of balance, the game doesn't necessarily feel right and something might seem a bit off. So if you are having an experience with that with a game that you're testing or developing and things seem a bit off from your intended experience, check your numbers and make sure that they're supporting what they should be in terms of your setting and your vision for your game.
I mean, the numbers are important after all. What is a tabletop RPG if not fancy math?
I know, right?
The only games with books this big.
Uh, I mean, Dwarf Fortress, if you put everything in there, might be able to compete.
Oh no.
um, but yeah, I prepared a list of a lot of settings, and I thought we go through each one of them and talk about what one might consider when using that setting. And it's more or less ordered by what's the most common, roughly. Don't read too much into it. But because of that, of course, we're starting with fantasy. The big one, the one with over 50% of the market share. Ian, you already mentioned a bit about that.
Mhm.
But one thing I want to differentiate it also is fantasy is pretty broad. So when we're talking here about fantasy, first let's focus on fantasy that is inspired by the past mostly. And then
Okay.
also there's a difference between heroic fantasy slash high fantasy or low fantasy or more realistic fantasy, and that also will influence your rules. So, what do you guys think?
Well, definitely one of the first things that I had originally thought about when you had mentioned what the topic is going to be is how intensely that also helps create the feel. And like when a lot of people are designing, like they're not thinking about how it feels. That comes out in play testing. But it's a good thing to think about. Like if you look at something like Call of Cthulhu, you can die really easy, and that sets the tension level at a certain low bar just right there immediately. Like if half the situations you can come across can put you into losing your character by death or insanity. Every single part of your decision process is very important. So, with them having the way they designed the system, it's all built around that feel of having you feel tension and the fear of losing your character at any decision. A high fantasy game, like we'd mentioned with the dragon game, is the complete opposite. If your characters never die, you're the epic heroes. It's okay. I mean, it's not for everyone, but for the ones that want to play that out, it probably is one of the better things for it. But if you want to have a chance at dying every freaking round, you need to play something like Call of Cthulhu or some of the old, like Vampire Fifth Edition, like
Urban
that.
fantasy and cosmic horror is further down the list. We're trying to focus on one setting at a time. Not sorry, I know I'm a bit
Oh
of a square,
gosh.
but I prepared my list. Okay.
Well, still on that same point, fantasy can include any of the other things that I've just mentioned, considering you
Yes.
can have a cyberpunk setting that is completely delved into fantasy. And cosmic horror is fantasy, it's not real. So when I'm describing the feel, it's like, what kind of feel are you attaching? Because when people go, the concept of having magic in your game decides so much about your game. And I'm like, if you entirely build it around it, yes. But in designing your setting, feel actually comes out a little more. If you think about it, if you give them a lot of ability to do something or a little, that completely changes the presence of the magic in the setting, changes the feel. So depending on setting will determine how much you want to design magic to be easy, to be difficult, to be nigh near impossible. It all depends. Heck, if we're doing a fantasy like a low dark setting, like um, Conan the Barbarian,
Mm-hmm.
only the villains got magic unless it's Conan's magical sword, which was needed to get past all the obstacles besides his natural sneaking and intelligence he had. Like, totally different than today's known barbarians, yes, but um, Conan the Barbarian's a great version of a low magic setting where all you're getting is magic items. But to design that as a thing, you're actually designing your system with no magical ability on your character sheet. You're just having certain things you can do. Like even the spellcaster directly in one of the movies mentioned, I can only do this so many times a day, because that concept of magic, limiting it per day, was a thing in the feel of the setting way back before D&D made it mainstream.
Hmm. That's also why I wanted to focus on the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. Because when we look at the numbers, that really influences how many spells you can give your spell casters, uh, how often they can use it, how powerful they are. But also, if you look at the marshals, right? Because usually you want the marshals to keep up with the caster, right, Dragon Game?
No, they completely disagree. What are you talking about?
So, if you're making it a high fantasy setting, the barbarian needs to be able to lift the giant boulder when he's full on rage, or at least a high level barbarian, right? To be able to keep up with the epic spell casting. But in low setting, it's more, at least, it's more or less peak human performance, or I guess a bit above that, right? Maybe talking about Batman level at the most, but yes, that's also important. And again, it's all about the numbers, right? And especially how the numbers compare with your average commoner. I mean, you can have high numbers if we go again to Call of Cthulhu, since you already mentioned it. Technically, D100, that's high numbers, but it's not
But it's
really
all
better
relative,
than
right?
the
I mean,
average Joe, because the average Joe
yeah,
also gets a D100. So it's
yeah.
all
It's
about the
like if
relation.
everyone's using the same numbers,
Hmm.
is it really high numbers?
Which is also something worth mentioning, the whole roll under system or difficulty class system. If you're aiming for something more realistic, roll under system can be pretty helpful, because the difference in the difficulty of a task that you usually encounter aren't that high, so you can have more limited sex um, um, limits that are not as cannot be set as nuances with, for example, with a difficulty class, where you need to really differentiate between opening a heavy metal door and again lifting the giant boulder and throwing it at the giant. Hmm. So I've been talking a lot. Anybody else want to say something additional to when it comes to fantasy?
Man,
Other than I have an irrational hatred of roll under systems, no, not really.
I mean, I've experienced that. The original skill system of Ishanakon World Shapers was a roll under, and all my playtesters were like, "We hate this. We want to roll over." What do
It's
you mean
interesting you
low
can sort of
number
apply that
good? High number good. Onga bonga.
yeah, but here's the
exactly.
deal. Did you roll over for your players?
uh, but I mean, the system had a lot of other issues, so it had to be reworked either way. But still, um, all right. How about we jump to the next one, sci-fi, and
Oh
how it.
boy.
I mean, redshifted here, Ian. We've got that's your speciality. Do you want to talk about some of your
Yeah,
experiences?
sure. Um, so going back to that example I gave about ability scores and the relative power of characters, compared to the NPCs in a setting. The idea of having um, kind of lower numbers was a very intentional choice I made for Redshifted. Um, because in Redshifted you quite literally are an average person, and so your character scores will tend to average right around those of your typical person off the street. And that really gets into the feel of Redshifted. It's the setting there is it's pretty dark. There's it borrows a few cyberpunk themes in the sense of kind of rampant corporate presence, um, just rampant industrialization, and there's this kind of overwhelming pressure from, I guess, the setting itself, that your character isn't necessarily special. You're not destined for greatness. If you want to achieve something, you better work hard at it. And it's um, but what this does is it means that encounters tend to be kind of scary, and victories tend to be extremely satisfying because um, if you're playing, in a more of a power fantasy or high powered game, um, you're running around with your laser guns or whatever and just kind of taking out everything that stands in your way, then you win your fights, but it may not feel that special. In Redshifted, you get on, you show up on some planet. You're like, okay, we took a contract to go scout this planet and plant a flag for this group over here. Let's go do it. And then you find the reason that maybe the people hadn't done this before is, oh, that wildlife's a little hostile. Oh gosh. And then and then suddenly you're in a fight with some horrific creature um, that just poses an immediate existential threat to you. I mean, imagine like, trying to fight like a lion or something like that, in real life, and you may not have like a great gun to do it. Um, but if you succeed, it's like, oh gosh, we actually did it. It feels amazing. I know I'm rambling a bit. That's just kind of one example. Um, but I think it does go to show how having these kind of lower numbers can affect the experience in a positive way as well. The challenges can feel hard, but overcoming them feels great, and that's something I that was very intentional for me um, when I was designing Redshifted. The idea of kind of working really hard, and if you can actually pull it off, breaking free, from under the thumb of capitalism or whatever government is kind of hanging over you.
I mean, sci-fi doesn't necessarily always have to be capitalism, right? Star
Well,
Trek
sure, yeah,
is a
yeah, yeah,
very
yeah.
famous example where money was, as far as I know, there is no money in the Federation and so on. But
Yeah,
yeah, one
I'm
thing
just
you
giving an
wanted to,
example of my system.
yeah, one thing you talked about, which I want to expand on, in sci-fi, unlike fantasy, usually you have the feeling, okay, the guy doesn't have an energy shield and isn't armored and he gets shot by a laser blaster, he's basically dead, right? The Usually the limitations, you think more about the limitations being more realistic, but you have technology to compensate for that. So one
Right.
way you can emphasize that is by not increasing the strength of your characters by leveling up that much, but allowing them, if they get the power armor or their super effective laser uh, blaster and so on, that those have a way bigger impact on their battle capabilities to really become superhuman. But
Yeah, like
yeah, yeah,
oh, so like having it be like more item based rather than just like character based in terms of stat gains over time.
yeah. But it doesn't have to be that way. Genetic manipulation, after all, is also a famous sci-fi staple, right? Mass Effect.
Hmm.
The average aligned soldier has extensive genetic manipulation, making them effectively superhuman, and that's also a way how you can overcome that. Of course, on the far extreme end, you have something like Warhammer 40k with the Space Marines, which are absolute demigods by stacking massive genetic manipulation, implanted organs, and high tech stuff. But yeah, I think Warhammer 40k is difficult for most. It's not exactly the average sci-fi setting, right?
Oh,
And the
no kidding.
power
It's
gap between average show and Space Marine, and even beyond that, with uh, um, the undead robots. What were their name again?
Necrons.
Necrons. Thank you. Um, you have like just this insane difference in power. So
Right.
let's be honest. If you make a Warhammer 40 game tabletop RPG or something in a similar setting, then you have to approach it very different than the average sci-fi setting.
Well, if you're gonna make a 40K setting, you also have to contend with the legality of whatever GW is gonna throw at you.
You can do inspired stuff, right? Just
Yes, you
grim
can.
dark sci-fi with
Yeah.
so on. But speaking of grim dark, the next does anybody else want to say something about sci-fi before I jump?
I would say that like typically you would actually think about more like I know you said items, but skills. Once you bring in sci-fi, there's now things like you have hacking, you have different types of science that are now easily applicable. It's not like years of training. You got a computer that can just
Right.
tell you what two things to mix together. There's whole new layers of skills that immediately upon thinking of sci-fi, I'm like, oh, anything futuristic is more skill heavy by design, in my opinion, than necessarily something like fantasy or medieval or even old western would require.
It does give you different ways of interacting with the world. I think that's really interesting.
Mm.
Yes, that's
Just the items, equipment, skills.
it. Just the big focus on technology of sci-fi is something relatively unique to a setting. I mean, there are others that go in a similar direction, like cyberpunk, but that's lower on the list. Um, so yeah, that's also like maybe crafting the techie. I have to admit, I'm a big fan of the techie guy. You know, the one who just builds his own stuff, hacks into systems.
Those are fun characters to play
Yeah.
for sure.
Okay, then let's jump to the next one. As I was saying, talking about grimdark. Horror is the next one on my list.
Oh
And
boy.
we were just talking about making your character feel more vulnerable and how it is if you want to be more realistic. Horror is probably the most extreme example of trying to make your character feel very vulnerable, because horror, you want that create that fear in the players, unless it's just like horror aesthetic, but then it's not real horror,
Right.
right?
Right.
Mm.
So something interesting about horror that I've learned from a friend of mine who's really into this stuff, both kind of traditional horror and cosmic horror, and really kind of every other branch of horror under the sun. Um, Something he told me is that um, less is more, and what this means is that um, to have a good horror setting in a game, often what you need to do is be careful not to overcomplicate things in terms of information, because a lot of horror lies in the narration, and I mean it's really all experience. Um, and so you need to, as a both a designer and a game master, you need to create enough room for your players to sort of get these thoughts in their head of what's around the next corner, what was that noise, things like that. Creating that atmosphere is really really big, and so you have to be careful um with how much or how deep your rules, I wouldn't say, sorry, not necessarily how deep your rules get, but how detailed some of your rules get. um that's, I guess, my 2 cents on designing a game like that. I admittedly haven't played a ton of horror-centric TTRPGs. Have either of you?
I've definitely played like a good bit of like the White Wolf publishing section, which is where Werewolf, Vampire, Wraith, and other games like that come in. And like you emphasize narration, and that is key to a lot of this. Their battle system is like 3 turns guaranteed. It's called 1, 2, and done, and their focus is on the narration and your response. They have fear systems, panic systems, and other mental things that, depending on which game setting you're playing at the White Book Publishing series, there's a different way for it to mentally impact you. And within horror, having that accounted for and having in-game responses of the character, it's kind of really important. You're not doing really good versus a horror villain if you're panicking. So you have to have mechanics to work around those specific aspects, or you're not going to be able to kind of present that story well to the players. Like, no matter how well you speak it, if the mechanics don't back it, it doesn't feel that way, even if it sounds in the description that way.
Yeah, when you mentioned making it simpler, it does make sense. Like, for example, also with survival horror video games, it's they try to limit what you can do so that you feel helpless. So it makes sense to, in a horror game, not give your characters a lot of abilities and stuff that you may combine and so on, but to limit what you have so that you're really thinking twice before you engage the werewolf. And with White Wolf
Right.
games, there's also something I want to talk about. Horror from the opposite perspective, the perspective from of the monster, be it that you play as a vampire, as a werewolf, and so on. Because that's completely flips their perspective, which can widely vary depending on what kind of monster you're playing, right?
This is
Vamp
true.
no. Vampires often about social manipulation, fitting right in without being seen, and so on. Well, if you play something more monstrous like a werewolf, that's more about avoiding civilization and but still finding a way to deal with your hunger and so on.
Mm. Every one of them has something that resembles hunger, a natural fear thing. Like for vampires, they have like, I think it's Rorschach checks or something. But basically, something really badly, you can get burned or have other aspects in the game happen. And if you get at one of these points, like everything is now worse for you dealing with it, trying to do it. And if you lose all those points, you lose your character. You have to remake a new character. It's gone. It's been lost to the beast. So, depending on which one, even wraiths can completely dissipate, lose grasp of their a reality and existence. Um, all of them. There's like 13 different freaking creatures you can play as. Each one of them has their own like hunger, weakness, and I forget the other aspect. Basically, a fear. And all three of those play huge aspects. I guess if you're playing the werewolf Garu stuff or hunters, it's kind of less important. You're more trying to be the physical combat, more dragon game like versions, but it still follows the core principles.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to add anything to horror?
I'm good.
All right, then let's jump to modern, which modern can be anything about just something realistic, right? The first thought is all the parodies of, fantasy characters playing games where they just have a plain old realistic job. But besides the parodies, you can go into crime investigation. That's a pretty classic one. Or, uh, go something more military if you're into that.
You know, I'm not sure if it's just a product of society or if it's just something that is actually key to modern games. But to me, I've always noticed the presence of cameras, the internet, telecommunications of all types, way more utilized in a modern game. And, it's either we're more used to it, but still, if you watch Star Wars and you don't question why are there no cameras, you're not thinking about the actual design from the bad guy's perspective. Only modern games seem to have cameras. Like Cyberpunk, if you add them in, but because hackers and like it just makes sense. But never more do we see these things, but in modern design systems,
Mhm.
because technically you could go back like one setting time wise and almost have the same thing as modern. What really makes it stand out is the utilization of the stuff that's common to us, our normal technology. How often in anything but a modern game do you bring out a cell phone and make a phone call?
That was what I'm talking about. So, oh, you have to be a semi-competent wizard to cast a sending spell. I could just call him. Like everybody can do it.
It's the funny thing about the movie Onward. Like, magic exists, but everyone kind of forgot because a dude figured out the light bulb and some other stuff. And now it doesn't take decades of practice to do magic. It just takes flipping a switch. So technology got adopted. It really puts that kind of, well, what magic would exist if technology came up, and how would you actually interact with it? And it's like the internet would dominate like a lot of stuff. Like, there's a whole school of prediction and knowledge stuff that's just gone the moment Google exists. So like, I think that's what predominates modern settings. Is it is attempting in your feel of design of not only the character sheet but how the game interacts to simulate our experience of current time. I think that's what modern, no matter if modern, when it becomes what cyberpunk is, and that's just modern, it will still be more realistic to the reality, because modern is trying to simulate what we're experiencing. So it's going to have a little bit more common things in it than it's going to have like, this would be cool kind of things. Modern's design depends on the time period we're in, but focuses on what is most common to us and how can we use it in amazing ways.
One challenge I've seen with modern systems is if we all live in this setting, right? But don't
Right.
know everything about the setting. So what can happen is that you set up an adventure as a game master, but misunderstands one piece of thing. Like you don't know exactly how the laws are around that or something. And then your players pointed out, wait a second, why does he have that? That's illegal. And I'm like, really? Oh, I didn't know that. One example is when it was a crime game, and they found the first what's ranger, I think is the best translation, dead in the forest. And I thought about in the USA they use shotguns to hunt, right? But in Germany, the game was in Germany, and in Germany those guns are prohibited. And one of the player pointed it out, and I was like, that wasn't supposed to be like prohibited. He was it was his rifle hunting rifle, right? And I was okay. Never mind. It's not a shotgun. It's just a baseline hunting rifle, one round. uh, so yeah, you gotta be careful with that. You know, the pitfall of playing in a setting that every that already exists and everybody knows, and then the GM does something else. That's like 10 times as can be much as a problem when you do a modern setting.
Yeah. It it kind of depends on, I guess, your players, but it also, as you pointed out, it kind of depends on how attached you are to like um to the real world in your setting. And so although modern is about, kind of where we are in terms of technology and to an extent culture, I would argue that a modern game doesn't necessarily have to take place on Earth specifically. You could kind of make up another setting. I think to an extent, removing things from reality um, can be helpful, at least to give you enough creative freedom so that you don't have situations like that where your players like, well, hang on, like that's illegal. It's like, well, it certainly could be, if you're doing this in like a real world like Earth country.
Mhm.
Um, so it's something to consider, I guess, is one way to possibly get away from that situation is if you, um, I guess, extrapolate a bit and move away um, from like real countries. But I
Yeah,
digress.
that's also one thing you gotta be careful. Once you're in a modern setting, you're dealing with modern politics, and I don't want to go too deep into that topic. I have to say that be
No,
careful.
no, no. It's like, here's the thing that I think's kind of a little core interesting point to add. It's, we talk about modern, But what would we call what we understand now as the modern setting when it's no longer modern? I think we will call it market punk because it is a utopian idea of market equality and equality, growth, and potential based off of it. It's the same thing we look at as cyberpunk, but that has now taken over. It's no longer a utopian idea that's on the threshold of failing or succeeding like any punk setting is. The utopian idea has already failed of the market utopia and has now entered cyberpunk. I think we will eventually refer to this as market punk because that's the topic at which was the utopian aspect that is the core of the punk setting. So if you're going to make a modern game not on Earth,
yeah, you know,
you're
the
still
thing
looking
is,
at those things are core to the concept.
I would, you know, I could add some points, but then I would need to start to get political, which I want to avoid on stream.
Right.
Well, you don't need to. I'm just saying that, yes, politics is a part of it, but that's because you can't turn on YouTube or Facebook or any app without seeing something political. It's common to us. So it is going to predominate. If you think about in a cyberpunk setting, somebody won. There's not really a majority of time a bunch of civil wars going on. It's some federation, some empire, something has conquered. Now people may be going against it. It could be market conquering, and there's, you know, corporate deals. So it's not really like they're against each other entirely, you know, all Shadowrun. But you still have that predominating political thing, even if it's under the guise of something else, like what took over, like in a cyberpunk setting. For us, it's really, we still have the, you know, vision of them being separated.
Of course, yeah, in a sense, everything, most things have a note of political or culture in them. You cannot completely avoid it. Cyberpunk, for example, is usually anti-capitalist, right? And
Right.
That's
and
true, but it's the corporations versus the ones against it. It's not like Russia is versus China in this intro political economic struggle of the game.
that's
Like,
also
I'm
I
probably
wanted
not running that.
one thing about market punk, like, okay, from the Western perspective, maybe, but capitalism in the sense is only pretty much done by the West. Many other countries do not have true capitalism. So, but I guess that again, modern setting can widely depend on where you put it, right? The culture changes it, and so on. So it can, modern might look boring on first glance, but it has a lot of potential to be very diverse, to be very controversial,
Yes.
and very spicy. And also, you can play around it, right? As Ian, you said, you can put in secret societies. Yeah, we're being controlled by Illuminati and so on. That's a modern setting, right? Even
Yeah, it
if
can
you
be.
start inventing stuff, or depending on the people, you're not inventing this stuff. If, depending on who you ask.
Right.
Okay, I'm getting too political.
I do want to add one last thing though,
Yes.
and that is that getting away from a setting that's necessarily on Earth is also a great way of getting away
Mm-hmm.
from those real world politics that are, you know, can be so divisive and so controversial to even discuss.
Yeah.
I
So,
would say
something to consider.
it's still core to the modern setting. You should have aliens with very controversial issues between each other if you're going to
Oh,
make a
sure,
modern setting.
sure. But
Just
all I'm saying is that if if you don't talk about if you're in a setting where you don't need to talk about real world Earth politics, you just avoid pissing people off quite as much, is what I'm saying.
that's true. It
Yeah.
was really classy of Star Trek to make people that were black on one half and white on the other. And the issue of the episode was because the colors were switched, they hated each other. But they're literally just the, like, look in a mirror.
Yeah.
Like, it was classy, but they still pulled it off.
I think Star Trek's handling of these kinds of issues in a setting that's separate from the real world has been absolutely brilliant throughout its entire runtime.
Oh yeah, they shut down the profit of war in one sentence. I was just like, thank you. I forget who the guy was and what chick he was arguing with, but like, yeah, no, they did really good with facing well, topics that normally cause a lot of stir, but they did it in ways that were really easy to take in and were actually built into the story, and not like just, hey, since we just mentioned this random thing, here's this 5-minute epilogue. No, they did it really well.
Yeah, what I also want to mention is I'm not telling you to avoid political topics. I'm just saying that you gotta expect some sort of backlash. This is the internet. If you're big enough,
Oh yeah.
There will always be some people that hate you, right? But
Oh yeah.
the question is, how much do they hate you, and how many people do hate you?
Yeah.
So on.
Yeah, the who hates you is the most important to me, because like with my current nerdy talks online, I have people that are hating me, but the reasons they're hating me doesn't make me look bad. And I think that's important. If people hate you because you believe in good and things and being equal and helping people, then, well, you're not the douchebag. They are.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's skip to the next one. Urban fantasy, a variation of modern, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing that differentiates urban fantasy from modern, I think, usually in urban fantasy, the fantasy part is hidden, secret, right? And therefore, you usually have systems built in where you're trying to incentivize the players to not broadcast their supernatural powers and so on. See, Vampire the Masquerade. It's in the title, The Masquerade. Do not break the masquerade, especially nowadays with all the cell phones.
Yeah. Man, it made me immediately think of that TV show Modern Family that's in a completely urban setting nowadays. And they all have superpowers randomly. And it's literally about how they had to hide it. And they were making up stories. So the social aspect was very important, because it's like, what do you mean? I didn't have a dog back here. Like, you have to be able to make that up the whole time you're going around. It's like, no, that was your summoned little buddy that you can do. You can't tell everybody about that. You don't have a dog. Like, this has to be a part of it. If you don't have a big social system, you're really just rolling the same check every time, and it's going to feel redundant and not really like it's accomplishing that. But if you have to, as a character, decide, do I try and manipulate them into focusing on something else? Do I outright lie to them? Is this one of the people that I can take on as a contact and trust them so I can tell them the truth? Or do I intimidate them? Like, your choices can now impact your safety of your secrets. So I think a social system could be very important to adding to the feel of that and the immersion of that style of setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That not leaving your webcam on. No.
Oh, yeah,
Imagine having your entire cover blown by like some teenager with a cell phone.
What teenager? No.
He's not real.
Oops, the hell portal opened up underneath him. Problem solved.
I guess the back rooms are real, guys. No.
Oh no. Send him to the back room.
Look, man, whether it be the Shadow Realm or the back rooms, like, if you have the power to send somebody there, I'm on your side. When you're around, at least, no matter how bad you are, I'm not against you.
Oh, so that's your opinion about that minority. Mm-hmm. Good
So,
for
Blaze,
you.
here's my question for you.
What's the question?
Blaze, I want to ask you,
Yeah.
do you consider urban fantasy separate from like a superhero focused TTRPG? Like, are
That's actually the next one. If you like, we can just
okay,
move over to the next one. I wanted to put them right after modern because they are basically variations of modern, right?
all planned.
Well, I wanted to say, like, I don't know what all you separated out into different categories, but a lot of times in a modern or urban situation, you can tweak it a little bit. Like, there was this really cool movie of how they went into this neighborhood to buy a house, and all of a sudden they now can't leave. And it just now became a survival setting in an
Oh
urban
boy.
area in a modern day. And it turns out there's like this multi-dimensional layering going on with this guy that raises up, and like the place eats the energy of people. Long convoluted story, but basically it's a survival story that ended up in the random middle of a urban situation with just one small tweak. They can't leave. Like they keep going down the road, they end up pulling past the same house. Like that kind
You
of
know,
scenario.
something I want to bring up, which I think all these settings have in common here, is when you're in an urban setting, um, you have a lot of stuff happening in a fairly small geographical area. And that can be really useful for storytelling because, like you have all these potential points of interest. You have like maybe like this shop over here that's under police investigation, and then you have like, this apartment block over here where some characters live and whatnot. And it forces you to really, as a character, it forces your characters to really like be part of the setting. Like when you're in a city and when like an adventure is taking place primarily in a city, um, generally, your characters are, I mean, you kind of have to live in that city, you may or may not be originally from that city, but that, I guess, sort of confining aspect of the space, um, it 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 doesn't really let you detach yourself from the city. It's like, well, now you live here too. You need to find housing if you don't already have it. Like you live in a neighborhood, there are things happening in there, and I think it just opens up a lot of intrigue again between your characters sort of having to be part of that setting or part of that area where the stuff's happening, and all the points of interest because again in an urban setting, you have like let's say you have like a shopping district. Well, on a single block, you could have 10, 20 different stores, all selling different things, they've all got different owners who have their own lives, their own stories, and their own what have you. So there's lots and lots of room for story rich stuff, and I think that's a really cool aspect of that.
Yeah, it's not like in fantasy where the adventurers can just flee out of the city and go to the next one, or in sci-fi. So, okay, I'm going to a frontier planet. Goodbye.
The
In
sea
a
nerds.
modern setting, you have the globalization, right? It's way harder to really get away from law enforcement, especially with international cooperation and so on. Yeah.
No, like not only is the like the whole communication thing like a big deal for like you have to interact with it, but I have found it to be one of the best tools of foreshadowing and dropping of information as a game master. I've literally recorded news broadcasts that shit that you hear that's like tonight at 9, figure out the story behind the killer at Frankie's. Stay by at 10 to see what you can do if you see that weird creature we've been discussing throughout the week. Like record those to just have them playing as I'm describing the scenario of it, like the new area they walked into, and they're like they just drove into the area and it pops onto the radio on the news, and I just have that going. and I would have dozens of them created, and some of them were just stupid, but all of a sudden that one y'all just ignored, and that had a really big important point that's coming up. So like the news was a living interactive thing that could be useful or not at all. It could just tell you, hey, there's a new deal down at the corner store on milk, and that just happens to be something that got added on. But if you listen to the local news enough, you'll hear about random deals about very specific locations, street names, people, and that can be details that the game master's handing. You just pre-record these in different voices, make sure to keep the same reporter voice for every time, and it becomes very immersive, and your players can go, wait, do you remember what that radio report from, and they're now talking about it like it was a real thing. That's something I think is like really modern compared to other settings.
That's such a cool way of like interacting with your setting and interacting with your players. Like that's something we should all be taking notes on, honestly.
It reminds me a bit of
It's like,
Vampire Bloodlines the Masquerade. Oh no, Vampire the Masquerade Blood. The old cult classic video game. Well, there are always radios in the background, and most of them are not really important for the story. But sometimes you hear like, "Oh, there was a mansion burnt down in this neighborhood," and you are like, "I know, I was there." Running from the flames.
Here, no, you don't. It's okay if they talk about what you've done until they start going, join us tonight at 10 when the detective discusses how he believes these are all connected.
Oh shit.
At that point, start worrying.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Or we interview the latest surviving victim, the first of this last band of attacks. Oh shit. Yeah,
He
see, like,
survived.
all of a sudden you can go, my players don't know what to do. Fuck, they're not getting the plot point. Tonight at 9, they get that shit now. They're not going the wrong direction. They're not, if they run town, this just became a whole new campaign. You know,
Yeah.
like this creates decisive actions. I love the things like I literally added intuition and a specific knowledge check system into my game so that whenever the players are like, I don't know what to do, or I'm like, they're not doing anything, the players and game master can call for one of these checks, which now gives the player information about what they're wanting, what they're trying to figure out, but it doesn't force it. Just gives those tools to help things move forward.
Mhm.
Yes,
So-
Matsuba.
Yeah. Do we want to add something specifically to superheroes? I guess one. Yeah.
I would say that like one thing I don't notice, but I think like specifically in art, does my design ideas that came into the core system, I put them as superpowers are a condition that you add onto the character sheet. Now, the reason I do this is not only can you have a list of specific effects that it does, but it in itself can level up. Like, let's say it's the Speed Force, your Flash. You have Speed Force level 1. It multiplies your speed, your intelligence, and these other categories by, let's say, 500. So if you can move 500 feet and 50 feet in 6 seconds or whatever your system has, 30 feet, you're now multiplying that by like 500. Well, that's
Don't
a
hit the
lot.
wall.
Yeah, that's a lot, right? And you'd be like, well, is that going to work out? Actually, if you do it properly, you can actually have the Speed Force multiplier up to, I think it's 150,000. And now 30 feet per 6 seconds is now going half the speed of light. So, yes, you can entirely simulate superpowers like that by having multipliers of your character profile using conditions. So I think it solves a lot of the problems by just having each and every superpower's various ability be a different thing on the character sheet, where it's all solved by going, hey, they got super strength. That means it multiplies these things by that level. Super speed. You can do it with any of the generic ones, even a lot of the more specific superpowers. Matter manipulation gets interesting because it's hard to actually scale it in different layers.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with superheroes is if we take at least the classic superhero universes, DC, Marvel, and so on, they are not built with balance in mind. The difference in
Well,
strength between different superheroes is insane.
mm-hmm.
Um, if you compare somebody like Superman with, for example, I mean, even Batman, right? They're put on side by side, but let's be honest, without kryptonite, Batman doesn't stand a chance, like at all. It's like half a second and he is just mush.
Well, like
uh,
that's why I say that Batman has a regular character profile. He doesn't have superpowers, so he doesn't have these modifiers.
mhm.
So even just numbers compared, there shouldn't be a challenge. It's like he can block this freezing breath, he could block the lasers. He's not blocking a punch at Mach 1. It's not happening.
But then you again you have the problem with, well, that's not balance if you invest into this superpower and suddenly you're dealing hundreds times of damage compared to the one who did something else. So it's something you gotta be careful about. And I think if you're
Yeah.
really making a tabletop RPG, I would just forego that and go way more balanced. That you don't have Batmans and Supermans, but something in between for all of them, where you,
Yeah.
yes, you can level up, you can develop your superpowers, and there will be a power difference. But it's more like the power difference between a ancient red dragon and a commoner, and not an ant and a god.
Fair. Although, I mean, there are many ways to balance things. You can always mess with numbers, but let's consider this for a moment. Let's consider that you actually maybe not something quite so extreme as Batman and Superman, but what if you have a party of player characters who have kind of minor superpowers, and there's this supervillain who, in terms of like raw ability, is much stronger, and you have to find a way to stop this supervillain from, say, like destroying, a whole country or something. Suddenly it can quickly become like a horror campaign almost, because
Mm-hmm.
you're forced to deal with something way outside your raw power level. You have to figure out how to outsmart it, how to evade it, how to just kind of think differently and overcome this challenge before you. It's just kind of an example I just kind of pulled out of thin air, but I think it really goes to show how just changing some aspect of your setting and like how the world works can totally change the feel of it. And I think that's really cool that that we have these options to
Hmm?
to mess with things and create these new settings. It's one of the things I love about
Mm-hmm.
these tabletop games
Of
is
course,
all it
you
takes is
can.
a little bit of creativity and spicing things up, and suddenly you have something totally new.
Yeah, of course you can mix and match, right, and create something new. Totally, like,
Yeah,
but we gotta need to have some sort of structure for the talk, right?
yeah.
We
Hmm.
cannot go through every possible combination ever made and ever made in the future.
No, I do recommend anyone that is designing a superhero setting to think about the utility of how you can limit everything else about the game, but still have the superhero power represented by a condition. This allows you to separate the power and effect from the rest of the game mechanics, but have it rooted in it at the same time. So you could simplify the game like Vampire and other White Wolf Publishing ideas, focus more on the narrative, but have the superpower fully given the time and respect it deserves.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Historical, which it's pretty wide. What I mean with historical is maybe it's a game in the Renaissance, medieval times, uh, some African tribes 500 years ago, Aztec Empire. It's very
Yeah, you're like Old West, Sandal Punk, Sand Punk, any of those classic historical real world kind of settings, even if they're placed on a different world, it's kind of all rooted in that realism, but
yes.
historical settings. Okay. Um, I'm not saying survival is guaranteed, but I will say survival is more important to the human species the further you go back in time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, in my opinion, it should have an element to it. Like if you're making a Paleolithic or Stonepunk game, you probably should have some level of survivalism built into it,
And
even if on a minor level.
funny thing, prehistoric is further down the list, and that's also what I
Oh,
thought about it. That in a prehistoric setting, survival mechanics become insanely important because that was the main challenge of the people back then. But
I would argue that survival, um, it does depend how important survival mechanics are to a game. I would argue it does depend on how far back you go, but I think it depends more strongly on how much realism you're trying to have, even in a completely modern setting. I mean, look at the real world, you know? Like, yes, we have all these amenities, all these, potentially great things, depending on what kind of society you live in. Um, but we still have to, we still got to how to, work and get money and figure out where we're going to shop for our food and whatnot. It's way easier for us than it would have been like way, way, way back in the day. But it's still an important consideration um, for a highly realistic game. So basically, when you drop out the bottom level of fantasy into no longer fantasy at all. So a lot of these historical things, I would argue that every historical game, could have survival mechanics and could have them written well. Not all do, but it's the option is open.
but I think you need to differentiate between different forms of survival. In a modern game, you can just
Or
summarize it up. Do you have enough money to pay rent and food?
oh,
Right.
sure, yeah, yeah. It depends on
But
how detailed do you want to get with the system.
if we go prehistoric, you don't have money. You have to hunt.
Yeah,
You have to gather. You
right.
have to cook your food or get food poisoning, and so on.
But even if in a medieval setting, you have to do many of those things. You
Yes,
may be
of
able to buy
course.
some food, but there's also hunting and farming and what have you.
Yes, that's
I do agree with
how.
Blaze on at least like shelter and things like that become a lot more predominant within a medieval setting, where in a
It's
Paleolithic,
true.
um, you don't know if that cave has some dudes that are going to come back to it, or has a bear in it right now,
Mhm.
or has a wolf pack coming back. You don't know if this has a hole and could flood up from underwater when it rains and actually fills up the thing and floods you out of it. There's
But
so many more issues with more things. Like, yeah, food and water is always going to be a thing now, but the difference between going to the store or having to find it and hoping it's not poisonous because I don't understand that it can or can't be, that's a I see where he's coming, where like every single decision you make is rooted in survival, where not every decision has to necessarily be the further you go forward in time.
right,
Mhm.
yeah.
It's a gradient scale, and mostly right with specific differentiations. But yeah, I agree. It's I mean, Eternal GM, we talk about the further you go to the past, the more important it's get. At medieval times, that's 500,000 years in the past, right? And of course, survival becomes more important, especially if you're a lower class. Mm. But yeah, since we're already talking about prehistoric, I just had the idea. What if you go a bit more on realistic route and cavemen with dinosaurs, right? So those survival elements become more extreme. Thinking of primal, right? And and again, it's a bit mixing in horror
I was
because
about to say the idea of like the Flintstones, but as like a survival horror game is actually kind of a cool idea.
I don't know if you've seen. I think the name of the series was Primal. Um, have you seen it?
I haven't heard of it,
It's a cartoon
but I can check it
series.
out.
No voices. It is like Stone Age people, but they're dinosaurs. But it's like the title said, it's brutal. First episode starts with the main character, human man, losing his family to a T-Rex similar
Jeez.
predator, and he tries to get revenge, and he teams up with another T-Rex like predator who also lost his family to the same apex predator, and the story is about the two of them trying to survive, overcoming the grief of losing their family, finding a new family in each other, and hardcore survival stuff. We're not just talking about dinosaurs, we're talking about mutant gorillas, giant spiders, giant bad monsters.
Oh boy.
It's really intense. Definitely not Flintstones. So, but yeah, anything else we want to talk about historical in general, which has not been indirectly mentioned already?
Besides, that is probably one of the more diverse variable setting names of historical. Like, that's a lot. I think technically the only things I could say were kind of from multiple other of the previous topics. They all kind of fit here. Like, again, equipment, your items, these are going to be very important. Skills, these are going to be important. If not, it's going to be hard to simulate a survival setting without the equipment and skills to do it. The further you go back, I mean, in Paleolithic, I doubt social skills were really that important. You know, technically, the average person nowadays, with as good as acting has gotten on simulating real human reaction and emotions, are better than the person that represented the king going, hey man, that guy's like acting a little strange, we might want to question this more. Nowadays someone can go, man, the way that he keeps responding every time you mention that, we need to question him, he's hiding something. Well, that's now the advance. Your average person can tell that person's acting weird. So social skills from now to medieval have that were pristine, epic, top of the line are now common. So I think in prehistoric time, we barely had any of that going. I would say it focuses a lot more on your ability to interact with skills and tools and other items you find and the environment itself.
I would actually, I would actually say that social skills have lowered. In medieval times, communities were way more important. You had to read people, you rely on them,
That's
and
important.
and also with all the new technology, we do actually see a reduction in social skill in the newer generations. Like, even if you just go 50 years back, it's a clear loss in social skills. So
I think we're
I
talking about
vehemently have
different
to
things.
disagree with you in that point.
No. We're talking about entirely different things. Me and your ability to communicate and work as a community has no grounds on my ability to read your body language, your face, and the emotions at which you're not speaking. That is a lot of what social skills and our social understanding is picked up on, which is a part of the evolution of this. I've been a practitioner and studier of this stuff longer than I've been into TTRPGs. I can actually point out to you specific references of how mentalism is a thing that didn't exist 100 years ago. So to say our understanding and abilities in general of that is gotten bad is the same thing to say that the actors on a Shakespearean stage had scores and mastery above the actors of today, which we know every generation acting is getting better because we are learning more of the psychology and how people interact, respond, how to draw emotions out of people. This has been a continuous growth of our understanding of acting, psychology, sociology, and the mentalism, which is the application of some of this stuff in combination. We are undoubtedly scores beyond that. Now, on a level of interacting as a group of people and being nice to each other, you're right.
what I want to say to that, of course, the experts are always getting better. That's just mostly with time experts get better. So yes, the experts of today are way better than the experts of the past. But if you look at the average and excludes the
Uh-huh.
experts, that's a total different story. But I don't think this is the place to really discuss it out. Just
Well,
wanted to add that.
let me
That
actually go one more point, and I'll
okay,
drop this
fine.
because you will be able to back this one up even. How long ago do you think it was that scientists learned boiling water made it safer? And think about how many people today don't actually know that one. How long do you think brand new scientific discoveries take to become general knowledge of the people? We actually know. We have thousands of examples.
Hmm. I don't know exactly
Less than
what you want
100
to what's your
years.
argument here, but like I said, like this is not the
It
stream to
takes
discuss this.
less than a century for any mastered new understanding to become commonly known and accepted by the people. We've watched this for several hundred years happening. So anything that was of a mastered level, because trust me, your average person's attempt at acting is better than trained
Dude, like
professionals way
let's
back in
not
the day.
discuss this. Like this is not the point. Uh, next one, cosmic horror.
I
Hello?
yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Uh, sorry,
I
if
want to
it
talk
was a
some
bit
more about
abrupt, but
historical.
you were a bit
Okay,
rambling, repeating yourself, and this is not the topic for the stream. That's why. Okay,
I
Ian, you were
wanted to talk some more about historical stuff, but I understand if we're running out of time.
okay. Historical stuff. What exactly? Like, if it's one quick
Okay,
thing, add it.
it's not super quick. What I wanted to do was talk about the importance of maybe breaking this down into some more categories, because if we're talking about the importance of settings, then each kind of snapshot, I guess, in history is going to have a unique feel to it, and
Mm-hmm.
that's going to influence the design of its rules and things of that nature. Um, to give some quick rapid fire ones, um, you've got Paleolithic stuff, you have medieval, Renaissance, um, and um, maybe some like kind of industrial or Victorian era stuff,
Mm-hmm.
kind of all the way up to to modern. Those are some quick rapid fire ones, and I just kind of wanted to get those out of there. That each of those kind of requires its own bit of attention to detail,
Yeah,
in
I
terms of
admit, Eternal GM also said it before. Historical is by far the most diverse of all the settings I mentioned
sure.
so far.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, we don't have the time to dive into each of them. So let's continue with cosmic horror. I think one thing about cosmic horror that differentiates it from normal horror is really that you cannot even start to comprehend the danger. So basically, every decent cosmic horror needs some sort of madness mechanic, even if it's not called madness, right?
Right. I think it also needs a degree of like an existential threat, the
Mm-hmm.
scale of this threat to, either like the world or your sanity or what have you, I think is really kind of big and important. Um, because it goes kind of hand in hand with the idea of kind of horrors beyond your comprehension. Um, you know, in terms of scale, in terms of like how intelligent these eldritch beings are, whatever the threat may be, it's important that it feels very big compared to your character. I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think. But under that, I think we already mentioned most of it in horror, right? It just
Sure.
more extreme horror in a sense. Yeah,
Right.
and you're right. It cannot just be the monster that eats the villagers at the night. It has to be an existential threat. I fully agree with you on that one.
Yeah. There's also in horror there tends to be like a degree of mystery and problem solving, of figuring out what's going on. I would say that cosmic horror approaches that mystery aspect in a different way. Um, Both in terms of like putting more importance maybe on the problem solving, the mystery and whatnot, but also applying some horror elements even to that process. That fear of like a big thing in cosmic horror is the idea of things that mortal minds aren't meant to comprehend. The idea that knowledge itself could cause insanity or delusions
Mm-hmm.
or other like psychological issues. Um, and it creates it all works together to create this unique sense of dread, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is not unique to cosmic horror, but is an important part of all cosmic horror.
Yes. In again, compared with horror, you can find out that the werewolf is weak to silver and get the silver. In cosmic horror,
Right.
it's not that simple.
Mm-hmm. That's a big part of it too. Is that um, the idea of the type of horror you're facing is something that isn't so easily overcome, and that makes it just that much scarier to deal with. You're like in like a survival horror thing, you might be able to, find your silvered bullets and, shoot the werewolf or what have you. Um, but in something like cosmic horror, it's like, I mean, not only, is the entity, potentially, may not have an obvious weakness, but like, heck, you may not even understand what you're looking at or how to even target it, much less find a weapon that will be effective.
Mhm.
Cosmic horror can include the idea of like forces themselves that may not have an obvious physical form. They may like manifest in certain ways, but um, but again, like dealing with them just isn't so simple. And this may not be cosmic horror necessarily, but this line really stands out to me from one of the Harry Potter books. You can't give it a mentor the old one too. And I just think that right there, that line, I think does a great job of summing up uh, kind of the level you're dealing with in cosmic horror. That conventional weapons, conventional means of dealing with the the frightening thing don't work.
Um, um, Eternal GM, anything you want to add?
No, that
Uh,
seems to cover it.
I guess then, since we're running a bit out of time, and I want to give each of us the chance to talk about how how their system implemented, let's just have two more of the settings. Cyberpunk would be the next one. And I think
Yeah.
the defining element of Cyberpunk that differentiates it from all the settings we already talked about is the horror of science going too far. You have it often, right? Cybernetic implants having side effects, you losing your
Hmm.
humanity. Many cyberpunk
Right.
systems have systems with that. Anything you want
Hmm.
to add?
I think it's the first setting that actually takes the concept of technology and instead of creating multiple more devices, it centralizes a lot into singular things. Like in Shadowrun, your armed little strap little thing could do so much beyond like internet purchasing, phone calls, ordering vehicle. It's got entire data storages. It's got your ability to hack on it. You can add in other programs that give it whole different types of functionality. If you got cybernetics, there's whole programs and capabilities of interaction. It's the first setting that takes all of this stuff and puts it in one thing. And there's multiple of those. And that's kind of unique to that setting because if you go too far into the future, like you get into a cosmic punk, kind of like Star Trek and stuff, you all of a sudden start having dozens of little different devices again, but each one of them can do dozens of things. But it's the first one that has a minute amount of items again, but there are a lot of compiled items and functionality.
Hmm. Again,
Yeah,
like you
it's an
mentioned, in
interesting.
the modern setting, cameras everywhere, right?
You would think, but all of media, how many times have you seen cameras in a cyberpunk setting? Unless you personally added them into a campaign, how many times in a movie in cyberpunk have you seen someone caught by a camera? Like in all of Star Wars, I know it's a little further in the future. There's no cameras throughout the entire Clone Wars. Like there's only cameras in certain special rooms. They're like nowhere else. It's weird.
Cyberpunk example, Blade Runner.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one, but
Oh, it's
so
a
I don't
great one.
I
It's
remember
great.
there being cameras, but I do remember at the same time the type of society you would expect there to be 15 down this hallway so that not a single foot is missing. The way they were trying to track the and track certain people and targets, you would expect the type of society and the way corporations have taken over for cameras to be literally everywhere. How do you maneuver around without a Black Widow face changing thing without being spotted every 10, 15 seconds? It just doesn't ever stop dawning on me that the lack of audio and visual security seems to be lacking in our creations the further forward in time we go, as well as the further back. But that makes sense. Technology didn't exist for it back the further you go. But the further we go forward, you would expect it to maybe not be as predominant or as invasive as a lot of it can be today's, but different styles, you would expect it to still have a major presence. But just to me, in some of our most popular futuristic settings, it just seems devoid of it. Now,
I
I don't
mean,
think that's realistic, but
depending on the cyberpunk setting, it might make sense. If you have multiple companies which have monopolies and basically no central government, then there isn't much of an incentive to have cameras on the street. The companies have incentive to have cameras inside, of course, yes, but they don't care about the streets. They just hire personal security, they protect their buildings, but everything else, they don't care.
well, that's fine. Have you played Cyberpunk 2077?
Uh, no, to be fair, I have not interacted that much with the cyberpunk
Okay,
settings in
to be
general.
fair to the setting, I haven't played it, but I had a roommate that played through a whole game. So I'm sitting there sometimes watching it while eating dinner. There's whole missions in corporate buildings he goes through, and because he kills people before they can make a report through like their earbud, he's not caught. There were no cameras. There was no evidence he was in the building. It
Uh,
If it was in a modern game, he would have had to hack the cameras or he would have had to shut the power off or something. Like you have the TV series Leverage. That's the first thing they do is make fake IDs and get into the security system to look through the cameras. They figure out how to maneuver to avoid them for the thief and the hitman. They have the con artist walk directly in because they know where that person should be. They have to do so much to fake the security system. So it always bothered me that the more futuristic you get, the less important that seemed towards any team planning to go into stuff. Like, for God's sakes, Doctor Who doesn't worry about cameras. It's weird.
I
I don't
think
think it.
that has to do, not because it's logical, but because the beginning of sci-fi and partially also cyberpunk is from our past time where camera technology wasn't that prevalent, right? It's people have difficulties understanding how technology evolves over time. And if in your time nobody has cell phones, nobody has cameras, and you try to envision the future, how are you supposed to know that that's going to be everywhere and that everybody is going to have a cell phone, right? It's not that easy. And I think those traditions have carried on over to today.
All right, but go with me for a second. You're Emperor Palpatine. You know 100% that this crystal here can record full three-dimensional holographic images
Hello? Uh,
that
is he also
allow
stuck? Okay.
you to see the area at which your hologram is being displayed. And you don't have cameras, those crystal cameras everywhere.
I fully
Like, you
agree that
really?
it doesn't make any sense. Like, that was not my argumentation. Like, of course, when you have the technology and you
I'm
have
just
a
saying for
totalitarian
story writing.
state like the Empire, totally, I agree. Cameras everywhere. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense from the story. I'm just trying to explain why their absence to such a degree from the cultural
I think it really
storyteller
is.
perspective. But yeah, you're right. In story, it doesn't make any sense. I did not want to
I think it
dispute that.
honestly is the result of the further, like, remember when I was talking about modern, what we notice is that there's a predominance of inclusiveness of stuff that's common in our lives. Part of that is security systems, part of that is cell phones, the internet. What we notice is these things become less predominant the further we get away from modern. And I just think it's a thing where people think the further we get away from today, the further we'll get away from other things. Like, for some reason, everyone in the future has hologram cell phones. Who knows if we go that direction? Audio may still be in style.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. We are talking about, like, in some cases, 3,000 years in the future, but I really don't see much more than what we're doing right now being a thing. And I don't think that guarantees a freaking, like, vibranium made hologram is going to be everywhere. I think that visuals and audio will always be what dominates it. There will be no reason to have a $500,000 device on your wrist.
Predicting the future of technology has always been nearly impossible. So I say, if you're going sci-fi, have fun with it.
Hey, we've actually done pretty good. And today, we actually, like, think about this. We can look back into the 1910s and the 1800s, what people thought technology would be like. Never before have we actually, as the human species, been able to realize that one day our holograms will be able to bleed, that they will be able to get sick, that we will be able to create a hologram that someone could do a surgery on because they're a student learning to be a surgeon. How people could have a physical therapist in their house because they downloaded the app for it. We've never been able to perceive technology so far advanced. Now, do we know that's going to happen? Of course. What do you do with a hologram? Do you know how cool it would be to download your basketball? Eventually, that could be something we go towards, and is actually highly realistic when you think about the idea of trying to supply people with things that are normally not as affordable. Once we get to the point of holograms on a realistic physical level, we're starting to break down the differences of how much different is the quantum energy that makes you from the quantum energy that makes this thing you can't tell is not real. At that point, going further in technology is just using that for things we couldn't comprehend using it for. It's not like technology has advanced, it is our usage of it. In 1,000 years, we will still be messing with technology similar today, like trying to entangle particles for long distance galactic communication or pulsar time base instead of a 24-hour sun system. We're still going to be using a lot. We can predict further ahead than we ever have. And that's because we now are looking at how below the quantum level it gets energetic. We've never had that understanding before. And now we can understand things in a way where, hey, 500 years ago, we didn't know what a molecule was.
Yeah.
Now we understand that these molecules break down eventually into a Planck unit of energy. And that would be theoretically the smallest piece. We can combine that into anything. Theoretically, being able to print out a hamburger from this energy by sucking in oxygen or something is a future technology. That is probably 5,000, 10,000 years away. We've never been able to perceive that far in tech. So, yeah, we haven't been able to predict things really that great. But I mean, we did have the great philosophers predicting steam technology and almost made it to help with getting stuff out of a coal mine. It's actually really cool stuff. We've
Yeah,
had
but that's mostly
way
survivors
more advanced.
bias. But Ian, you wanted to say something.
Yes. I think that one thing that really influences the direction our technology is going in is convenience. That at least in Western
Mhm.
cultures, we're kind of obsessed with it, and that's a big driving force that we can use, maybe for prediction, but also for analysis of, say, um, cyberpunk and so on. I do want to talk a little bit more about cyberpunk, just so we can get a little bit about that discussion in. Um, One thing about cyberpunk that is kind of a sort of defining trademark of it is that, um, technology, it seems like it no longer serves the masses necessarily in this setting, and that's why I think a lot of the anti-corporate sort of storylines crop up within those settings. Um, is that sort of capitalism has kind of run away on us, um, and all this cool technology, um, well, it may have benefits, for individual people. It's a lot of it is developed and marketed and sold, um, in a way that almost exclusively serves to benefit the capitalist system that dominates the environment of these settings, which is why you have these huge corporations, and it's generally like a small number of huge corporations that dominate market sectors. You've got monopolies, you have or close to monopolies, um, things of that nature, and I think those are all hallmarks of that.
Hmm. Sure. We're running a bit low on time, so I would say we skip all the other settings and start talking about our systems and how that influenced us. I think Ian, your would be great if you started because your system is specifically set for one setting, right? While uh, Eternal GM and my tabletop RPGs are more flexible when it comes to settings.
Sure. Yeah. So my game Redshifted, it has elements of both sci-fi and cyberpunk in it. Um, as I mentioned before, it's got a lot of the uh, sort of industrialization and the social elements of cyberpunk, where you have very, very powerful, dominant corporations in society, that are, there's a lot of focus on them mass producing all these consumer goods. Small businesses are like very inconsequential in most places in the setting. Um, but then you also have the sci-fi aspects of, it's kind of very far in the future. Um, there's lots of space exploration, um, and I kind of let those two things run together. So, like one thing that happens in the setting is you have these big corporations that are sponsoring colonization of new planets because they have accumulated all this power and they want to accumulate more. For example, like a company that specializes in like manufacturing of metals and things like that, um, might set up like a mining colony because they want more raw materials and they want to have everything sort of enclosed and self-contained in terms um, of like their supply chains and everything, so they're not really beholden to anyone else and they can kind of expand their corporate empires. And then on the flip side of it, you have individual people who have very little power, and it's kind of bleak in a lot of ways. I'm trying to figure out where to go from here because we know we're a bit short on time. do you guys have any like questions about my game setting or how I work within that setting in terms of my
Hmm.
game design?
Well, I wouldn't have so specific more question like how specifically the sci-fi setting influence specific rules. Uh, but I don't have a specific question.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, Patrol GM, do you have any questions about how I've implemented things in my setting?
Uh, Not necessarily, because as like y'all both know, I took a kind of outsider's different opinion of how to design the system, and it
Fair.
worked out for me. But
Fair.
designing a system specifically on, well, a system based off of the setting is not something I really ever thought
Ah,
much about
okay.
until this previous week, where I'm like, well, how could an individual setting? And I looked through my history of different games I played, and it's like a lot of things I brought up with the cyberpunk sci-fi kind of setting. Like, how does that apply to your game? I guess would be it, because that's, in
Okay.
my opinion, what
That's
sci-fi
fair.
is. It adds
Yeah.
more equipment, tools, and skills-based focused things, where as combat doesn't necessarily require as much of an in-depth system for it. So where
Okay.
did you stand with all those kind of things when making it?
Sure. Yeah. Um. So yeah. So since I did design my rules very much based on my setting and with the intention of supporting that setting and the feel of that. One of the things about my game Redshifted is that because you're playing as just kind of an ordinary person, and um, encounters like combat encounters are scarier and things like that. Yeah, I did design some rules around that. So, for example, um, again those kind of like basic character stats. One of them is endurance, and that affects like your maximum hit points and things like that. Um, well, when you go down in combat, like say when you reach 0 hit points, you don't die immediately. I really did want a lot of um, I did want to have a lot of player agency in that. So you can still act, but you're down on the ground. You can at most crawl, and um, that endurance score, you're taking damage to that endurance score now that you're out of hit points, which really incentivizes your allies to help you or you to reach that first aid kit if you have something before you completely bleed out and die. Um, so it's much more intense. Also, damage tends to be kind of high um, relative to your hit points. You might be able to survive a hit or two, with or maybe a bit more with the right equipment. Um, and that can feel really good, if you're going for like heavy armor and stuff like that, and you can, absorb, several hits before you go down. But again, like that requires that you lean directly into that playstyle, and most people won't because it comes with trade-offs. Some people will because it's their playstyle, but in any case, the average person won't be able to survive very many hits, and so it encourages the use of cover. It encourages the use of careful teamwork. Like you're gonna be talking, to the other players and being like, okay, guys, how do we approach this? Okay, let's go to this cover. Let's head over here. Um, because it ultimately comes down to that fear of losing your character. You really don't want to lose your character. Um, um, and so you're incentivized to make those smart choices when you're approaching difficult situations like combat. And it makes you think twice before getting into a fight too. Some fights aren't always avoidable, but others, when you're like, hey, should we go fight that street gang? Like, no, no, we should not. Um, is one way I handled that. Um, if I know we're running out of time, so one more thing is the morale system that I created. Um, when you're in a survival game, I think characters like morale, like just their mood, is an underrated thing. And so I created a morale system that applies a modifier to other roles and things like that. And the idea is you should care about how your character feels. Like, are they getting good food? Are they getting good sleep? Uh, are you actually treating their injuries? Things of that nature. which again leans into that survival and also creates some connections with the idea of the cyberpunk elements of the game. The idea that, oh, you're just an ordinary person, you're not special, things like that. Because society can be brutal in a setting like that, and there are things that will penalize people's morale again if they don't take care of themselves, if they um, don't find ways to stay happy. That's kind of what I've got for that.
Hmm.
All right, then Eternal GM. You said you didn't really think about that much. Do you still have something to add?
Because because for the angle at which the core system was designed, you have to keep in mind I was so tired of the idea of I want to play fantasy. Okay, so I have to learn D&D. I want to play Cyberpunk, so I have to learn Cyberpunk or Shadowrun. I want to play Cosmic Horror, so I have to learn Call of Cthulhu. So I said, no, I'm building a system of mechanics based off of an Omni setting. You go far enough in the Mystic Portal universe, you will find something that represents the exact setting you're looking for. So, in order to accomplish that, I had to put a comprehensive social skill system, a comprehensive knowledge system, a comprehensive all this. Like our character profile looks kind of crunchy and bulky. And that's the end of it. Everything else flows once you're past character creation. So that's a problem we came across that we just accepted. In order to accomplish the ease of learning, simplicity, and variability, the character profile had to have a lot of different things you could reference to for different aspects. It's really simple to use, but when you look at how would you do that, well, you can't have a crap ton of technology skills. So technology is a knowledge where craft and operate are skills. Within that, craft and operate can mean totally different things, but by adding technology it can mean so much more. So I don't actually have to add any skills when I get to making the cyberpunk setting. I will make new items, new equipment, new gear, and subclasses that specifically focus on it. Like I'm going to have a psionic technician that focuses on using its psionics to control nanobites to simulate magic. um, you are able to do things like that. You can compare levels of weapon technology in a gradient system compared to each other. By never thinking of how to build my system based off of a setting, I kind of did. Because an omni setting should be one of the list of settings. It's not trying to exclude, it's trying to represent all. It's one of the more difficult tasks to undertake. So ultimately, you have to realize that the character profile or your character sheet ultimately dictates what is possible in your game. And that's what I learned from this. So the first thing was design a character profile that everything from superpowers to a dude with a hammer to medieval times to magic and psionics, it all can be done with the same character profile. Hence conditions for superpowers, different tech and subclasses for different tech levels, and things like that. So that's what I mean by I didn't really think about setting on how to design the game. I thought about how to not exclude a setting or type of abilities with my system. So it was kind of the opposite way of looking at it.
Mm, yeah, in my system, I wanted to keep as simple if possible. So I did not try to simulate each single aspect of how you could play it, but just simplify it, right? Physical projectile is physical projectile, no matter if it's an arcane blast, a telekinetic uh, blast, or if you're just throwing a rock, or you have a cannon that shoots a steel ball or something. I try uh, to not exclude as much flavor from the rules as possible, so that you can put whatever you want into them, which I think helps in simplifying the system. But One problem that you find is, as we talked about, right? In a horror game, you're supposed to be super vulnerable, but in a high fantasy game, you will need to be almost unkillable. How do you represent that with one system? My solution were the alternative rules. The standard rules put you, when it comes to powers and growth potential, somewhere in between low and high fantasy, which I think is a nice medium. Gives you a good chance to die if you're not careful, but uh, but you got plenty of tools to act with. But what if you want something more grimdark, but you still want to be able to fight back? For those, I have the Mere Mortal rule set, which significantly lowers the amount of stuff you get when you level up, making you, especially on higher levels, significantly weaker than your normal level up counterpart. Then, okay, but what if we're just normal humans? Only human alternative rule set strips you from all your abilities, all your features, and so on. And basically, you only have skill points left. If you want to be proficient with weapons, you need to invest a skill point. That's not something you just get, right? A normal human is not trained in weapons. So, but on the other end, I also have uh, an epic hero rule set, which pretty much doubles your vitality, makes it harder for you to die, and so on. So I give the group the tools to fine tune the system to the difficulty that they are trying to achieve, to the atmosphere. Cosmic horror, take only human. Low fantasy, mere mortal. High fantasy, epic heroes, or just a standard rule set, and so on. That's my approach. How I close the gaps between the settings.
Well, I think you two have some really, both have like really creative approaches to this. The idea of making a system that can handle multiple settings, or is simply like setting agnostic, pretty much is that's definitely a big challenge. And
Mm-hmm.
so you two have definitely had some very creative ideas in overcoming
Like
that. Good job.
I'll tell you something, like Blaze's system, I guarantee you right now, without work, or let me correct that, without as much work as my system, could simulate Pokemon and Onimusha tomorrow. My system might actually make you feel like you're training Vulpix's fire breath to be larger, better, but it's going to take a lot more work to do it. Where I appreciate the fact that I have a competitor out there that's doing something very similar to me that says, yeah, I'm going to go with the storytelling and narrative element of it more and allow you the freedom to say, this doesn't actually change mechanically what you're doing, it changes how it is presented. That's great. You are able to do more things than I can ultimately, and I accept that. I'll just say that there's going to be things that you'll say, damn, if I didn't simplify my system like this, I couldn't have done that. But I accept that this is the way I wanted my game to be, and that's the beauty of it. He will find things that I accomplished he can't because of the way I designed it, and vice versa.
Yeah,
And I think that's just showing that we both are intelligent enough to know what we can and cannot do with our system,
Mm-hmm.
but also humble enough to admit that's just cool. But it's not what's going to work in my system. And we're also, again, wise enough to not try and force it into our systems. That's the key part of what we both did, making something that is effectively an omni setting. Because if you make one mistake and you're like, fuck, now that Stormtrooper can blow up the Death Star, that's a possibility if you fuck up. In our system, I have a scale of 1 to 10. Well, that's your weakest weapon to your strongest weapon on the infantry level. But what's tier 2? Tanks. So tier 100 might be the Death Star. So what is that saying? Well, tier 100 means I divide the damage by 100 on whatever your stormtrooper did. Basically, there's no way you can damage the Death Star. It's going to be null and void. But if the Death Star rolls as low as it possibly could, it's still multiplying by 100. And I'm pretty sure that destroys not just the stormtrooper. So I can do things like that where there will never be an argument over, hey, is this superpowered character better than this one? Well, if we got the character profile for both, we know exactly the answer to that and in which areas they are stronger or weaker than each other. You can't do that with a system that tries to be as more free, because what's the difference between I manipulate fire, I create fire, and I am fire? Well, our system might take that into consideration, where another system is just describing the difference from it. So where I'm working for a month or two, he works for 5-10 minutes, writes up 3-4 different descriptions of these feats that you can take, and all of a sudden you can now be the Flash, you can be a firebender, or you can be Vulpix, just like that. And so it has its merits. But I will say, and I don't know because I've never played your system, I'm just going to use one I've watched an example of. Damn it, I can't remember the name of it right now, but he's okay as DM. He made a Sagas, that's it, system and genre agnostic system. And it's cool. Every week he can go from Pokemon to Resident Evil to sci-fi, and it's great. But it also had the problem, like, where the Vulpix is like, so can I use my fire to melt this thing? Let me explain. A Vulpix's fire is strong enough to melt just all sorts of metals. But a random steel hurricane fence was not able to be gotten through by a Vulpix because it could only produce a certain amount of fire. And I'm like, why? Because, well, I got this many levels in my system and the top level is this. So it's not that you don't know Pokemon. It's the system can't facilitate Vulpix being able to melt the fence at level 1.
I think one of the main differences is in my system, the game master balances the world around the character stats, while your system balances the character stats around the world. So you're talking about, can he melt the steel or not? I have rules how much vitality does an object have, how high is his armor, but I have 3 examples: normal, superpowered, and realistic. So if you're in a realistic setting, you take the realistic, and suddenly that steel has an insane amount of armor and an insane amount of vitality, because a normal dude with his fist is not going to get through that steel wall, right? But if you're talking about a super powered setting like Dragon Ball Z or DC Comics, suddenly it's easy, and then you take the super powered. So uh, I find it fascinating how we approach that design problem from 2 different directions. Mm.
Yeah, mine. The simple secret is I want my game system mechanics to be the physics of the Mystic Portal verse. Meaning, I don't care at what time period or what setting style you're in. Science is science. If this is a rule of physics here, it's a rule of physics there. If it's different, there is actually a reason in this area why it's different. That was very key to design, because I wanted it to be the same regardless. Even if this setting doesn't have magic, every character in this setting still has their weakness or benefits against magic or neutrality to it. It's a part of reality. So that did create some issues, because, like, yeah, does the Terminator get held by the hold person spell? Like, I have to know that. I can't just go, well, GM discretion. No, because it in physics, does this work or not? I have to make those core decisions from the very beginning, or I'm going to have continuity errors. And in a mechanical system, it's best not to be like the Dragon game and have 3 different origin stories to devils and demons. It's not good.
Hey, but if your system is super successful, becomes the main line, and eventually some company buys it, the latest when you die and the rights go somewhere, then there will be 3 origin stories for your devils. Trust me.
So the lesson here is don't die.
I'm working on that. No. Look, I already got the name. I just need to live it now. Eternal GM.
Hey.
Yeah, the problem is eventually it's going to be in the public domain. And then you suddenly have millions, okay, millions is a bit, but hundreds of different origin stories for your devils, each fanfiction having his own thing.
Oh,
This is
gosh,
true,
not the fan
and also
fiction.
the reason behind multiple editions of D&D to avoid legality.
Yeah,
There you go.
that thing, right? So, yes, of course, retcons are not always something nice, but if you're talking about something this old and this big that has gone through this many hands, uh, you know, it's a miracle that it doesn't have more retcons.
Seriously.
Look, let's just make a deal that if any of us becomes rich, as soon as Batman and Superman hit that Creative Commons, we making a movie. And like y'all laugh, but I'm not screwing around. Like if I had 20 million to throw into a movie and make those actors a lot of money, and it's like, yay, I made like $10,000 off of this. Let's make the next movie and keep going and like just destroy Hollywood so they can stop underpaying people. Yeah, let's fucking do it. If they're gonna let me make a Batman movie,
Oh,
I
no.
will read into so much and
Careful.
literally make the Justice League storyline as the characters comically came out. So their arrival into the system is when they literally hit Creative Commons.
That reminds me of a YouTuber who is actually taking very old superheroes that are in the public domain, and he's making his own movies and he's making his own cinematic universe with all those public domain superheroes. But the thing is, why I laugh is because I know I would not do a good job. I don't think I could make a good movie. But hey, if you think you can do it and you have the money, go for it. uh, but yeah,
Could I
I
get
don't think.
just a moment before we end here?
What? I, oh yeah, right. We're
I was
about
wondering if
yeah. Ian.
I could have just a moment before we to say something before we end. Um, and so about my system, it's I know we've talked about, both of your systems are kind of setting agnostic or setting flexible. Um, and I just wanted to say about why I've continued to pursue a specific setting for mine. The advantage that I enjoy with having my game all focused around this one very specific setting is that it gives me the room to expand on that lore to an incredible degree. And what this means is that like a GM could come in, not having a ton of their own uh, like ideas, like maybe they don't have enough to like create their own fully unique setting or something. They can literally just pick up what I've written down, and they'll have so much inspiration because they'll have like entire histories of like the playable species in the game, the history of the galaxy at their fingertips, and I think that's really cool um,
Mhm.
that I can give them that, and so that's why I've pursued what I have.
Yeah, that's definitely
No,
a strength of a focus.
100%.
Yeah. All right, so we're running out of time. Does anyone of you want to advertise something?
Well, two things. Yes, I got to advertise something. One quick, like 5-6 second thing to add to what he said. Do not try what I did. It took 20 years to figure out how to make a fucking Omni setting with literal lore and history and that connects everything. Do not do this to yourself. Second off, I am actually been pushed by online commenters to finally go, you know what? I am nerdy enough to make some side content about stuff. So I am about to be destroying everyone's memories and nostalgia about the Daredevil Netflix series and other series. I have already caused so many people to be like, no, it's not true. And then I literally quote the Marvel Encyclopedia, tell them what page and where to look it up. And I'm actually having people go, why are you the only person saying this stuff? Why is there no channel talking about this and being honest about Marvel? And I'm like, because people that are real fans are quiet and assholes are loud. Like they go, the MCU. I'm like, why? Because She-Hulk isn't a man, and because She-Hulk is presented for women. And they're like, yeah, it was full of like LGBTQ and all this stuff agenda. And I'm like, really? Where? I just saw a girl shaking her ass on screen. I'm like, dude, it's cool if you want a sausage fest, but I like tacos. It's okay. Your preference is your preference. But I don't want the MCU sausage fest, and I don't want the MCU either. I want accurate representation. And sorry, She-Hulk isn't bad to look at. Neither is Elektra. So let's like stop trying to masculinize everything and think that having a woman on screen demasculates you for anything other than pointing out your bigoted opinions, which have no basis. And stop being upset that She-Hulk fucking broke the fourth wall first. That's comic accurate. Bitch did it before anything in media, period. And people hate it. It's like,
Well,
don't
no,
hate
she wasn't
the
the
fact.
very first one, but yeah, it's definitely something she was known for.
She was the first in Marvel Comics to break the fourth wall.
Yeah, that's something different to say like ever. And cartoons have been
Well,
breaking the
Nobody
fourth
said.
wall for.
besides people on stage, until the 19, I think it was 60s, where drugs were on rampant and a character broke the fourth wall. Sir, no, I'm sorry. Fourth wall breaking is a reference to a guy on a stage referring to the audience. Even the Truman Show didn't refer to the audience of the movie. We didn't actually have that in media until the comics in the 1960s or 50s, whenever She-Hulk officially broke the fourth wall. And then it became more popularized.
All
I've
right.
got something to advertise real
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah.
Real quick. My game Redshifted. We are moving into open beta testing.
Nice.
It's going to be in either I think February or March. If you're interested, follow me on Twitter. That's Redshifted Game. There's a Discord link to the server in on my profile there. Come check it out. I'd love to have people. I'd love to get new opinions on what the game is like, how you guys are enjoying it. I've got scenarios ready to play. Come check it out. It's going to be a blast.
All right. Excellent. One thing advertisement for my site. Ishanekon Arena next month. There's still room for more players. We've got 3 so far. It's going to be my birthday special. That's going to be a bit
Nice.
wonky. So if you want to give me a birthday gift, just either join as a player or join the stream watching. It will be fun. But of course you don't have to put it. So
Hey, just be sure to put on your good suit and say nothing about
it's
it.
my
so people
birthday.
like-
I wear whatever I want. All right.
Whoa,
yeah,
whoa,
but
hold
then
on
you
there.
can say you're wearing your birthday suit.
Hold on.
No.
And that's how we got demonetized.
Yeah,
No,
I'm sure
kidding.
it was that and not talking about tacos.
Right.
Anyway, do not worry. It will be PG-13. Good night, everybody.
Peace.
Bye.